The morning after my 18th birthday, my father walked into my living room holding a stack of legal papers and a pen. A victorious smile stretched across his face. Snorts. He didn't say, "Happy birthday." He didn't ask how I was feeling after losing my grandparents, the two people who actually raised me. Instead, he tossed a pen onto the coffee table, looked me dead in the eye and said, "Sign over the estate, Hannah. You're too young to handle this kind of money, and frankly, it belongs to the real family." He thought I was just a naive teenager grieving my grandparents, completely helpless and easy to intimidate. What he didn't realise was that I had known about his plan for months, and while he spent midnight celebrating what he thought was an easy score, I was executing a plan that would leave him completely empty-handed. My name is Hannah Morgan. I'm 18 years old, and until that morning, I thought my father had at least a shred of human decency left in him. I was sitting on the sofa in my late grandparents' suburban home, holding a cold cup of coffee, trying to process the absolute silence of a house that used to be full of warmth. My grandparents, Arthur and Eleanor, had raised me here. They were my absolute world, and losing them both within months of each other felt like having the ground ripped out from under my feet. Then, snorts. The front door clicked open. My father, Richard, walked into the living room like he already owned the place, flanked by my stepmother, Evelyn. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't mention the fact that yesterday was my 18th birthday. Instead, he dropped a thick manila folder onto the mahogany coffee table right in front of me, tossed a sleek pen beside it, and folded his arms. "Sign over the estate, Hannah," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any paternal warmth. "The house, the catering business, the liquid accounts, all of it. You're 18 now, but you're far too young and emotionally unstable to handle this kind of asset management. Frankly, it belongs with the real family." Evelyn offered a tight, artificial smile from behind him, her eyes already scanning the living room like she was calculating the resale value of my grandmother's antique furniture. They expected me to burst into tears. They expected a frightened, grieving teenager who would meekly sign whatever paper was put in front of her just to make the pressure stop. I looked down at the signature line on the document, then looked up directly into my father's cold, expectant eyes. I didn't tremble, I didn't raise my voice. I simply leaned back, folded my hands over my knee and said, "No, Dad, I'm not signing a single thing." To understand why my father thought he could march in and strip me of everything, you have to understand the kind of man Richard is. When my mother passed away when I was just 6 years old, my father didn't step up. He checked out. Within a year, he married Evelyn, a woman whose entire personality revolved around status, designer handbags, and living well beyond her means. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was an inconvenient reminder of Richard's past and an extra mouth to feed. It was my grandparents, Arthur and Eleanor, who stepped in and took me into their home. They didn't just give me a roof over my head. They gave me a masterclass in life. My grandfather started his catering and event planning business from scratch, building it into a multi-million-dollar local institution through relentless work ethic and unshakable integrity. Growing up, while other kids were playing video games, I was sitting at the kitchen table learning how to balance ledgers, manage vendor contracts, and understand profit margins. My grandparents made sure I knew every inch of the business because they were building it for my future. Richard and Evelyn, on the other hand, ignored us for years until my grandparents' health started failing. Suddenly, the father who barely called on my birthday was visiting twice a week, bringing cheap supermarket flowers and asking suspiciously detailed questions about property deeds, offshore accounts, and who held power of attorney. They smelled money, and like vultures, they were just waiting for the right moment to strike. They thought they were being discreet, but greed makes people careless. Exactly 2 weeks before my 18th birthday, my grandfather's condition deteriorated sharply. While he was resting upstairs, Richard and Evelyn slipped into his home study, leaving the heavy oak door cracked just an inch. I was coming down the hallway with a tray of fresh tea when I heard Evelyn's sharp, anxious laugh. "If she turns 18 without signing Richard, the primary trust unlocks automatically," she hissed, her voice laced with desperate urgency. "She gets full control of the main bank accounts, the real estate, and the entire catering company. We won't see a single dime." "Relax, Evelyn," my father replied smoothly, the sound of ice clinking in his glass echoing through the quiet room. "The kid is completely overwhelmed right now. She's grieving, she's exhausted, and she relies on me for guidance. The morning she turns 18, I'll hand her a stack of quick claim deeds and asset transfer forms. We'll tell her it's routine paperwork to protect her from tax liabilities and estate management stress. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. What about that lawyer of your father's? Evelyn asked. The old guy, Vance? I've already bypassed him. Richard sneered. I'm bringing in my buddy Greg from City Legal. He drew up a draft power of attorney that looks completely official. By the time Hannah realises what she actually signed, the assets will already be restructured under our holding company. She won't have the cash or the legal standing to fight us. Standing in that dimly lit hallway, my hands shook so violently the teacups rattled on the tray. My own father was setting a legal trap to rob his newly orphaned daughter of her entire future. But as the initial shock burned away, it was replaced by a cold, sharp rage. They thought I was a naive little girl. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The moment I heard them plotting in that study, I knew I couldn't rely on tears or emotion. I needed ironclad legal armour. The very next morning, while Richard was off boasting to his friends about his upcoming windfall, I quietly slipped out of the house and drove straight to the offices of Vance and Associates in downtown. Marcus Vance had been my grandfather's closest friend and trusted estate attorney for over 30 years. When I walked into his office and laid out what I'd overheard, Marcus didn't just look angry, he looked disgusted. Your grandfather knew what kind of man Richard was, Hannah, Marcus said, leaning back in his leather chair with a calm, knowing smile. Arthur wasn't naive. He anticipated Richard might try something aggressive the moment he passed. Marcus opened a safe behind his desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound binder. He revealed that 2 years prior, my grandfather had established an irrevocable family trust. Under its strict terms, the $1.5 million estate, the primary residence and the core catering operations were locked tight. They were scheduled to transfer directly to me at midnight on my 18th birthday, with Marcus designated as the independent sole executor. Richard's buddy Greg can draft whatever junk documents he wants, Marcus explained with a sharp grin. Without my signature as executor, those papers aren't worth the tree they were printed on. Together, Marcus and I devised a quiet counter-strategy. We decided to play completely dumb. I would act like the clueless, grieving teenager Richard expected, letting him believe his plan was smooth sailing. That way, he wouldn't try any desperate illegal forgery tricks before my birthday. We set the trap, letting Richard march blindly towards the morning after showdown, entirely unaware that he was walking straight into a legal brick wall. Which brings us right back to that cold morning after my 18th birthday. Richard stared at me, his eyes narrowing as my refusal echoed through the quiet living room. The arrogance on his face quickly gave way to a dark, menacing sneer. You think this is a game, Hannah? He snapped, taking a step toward the coffee table and towering over me. You don't get to say no, I'm your father, and what I say goes. Outside this house right now is a moving truck and a crew ready to take possession. I've already notified the catering staff that I am taking over management effective today. Evelyn folded her arms, chiming in with that infuriating, condescending tone. Don't be stupid, Hannah. Sign the papers or your father will ensure you don't receive a single cent for college, living expenses or rent. You'll be out on the street with nothing but the clothes on your back. Richard shoved the pen further across the table, his patience completely worn thin. Sign the damn paper, Hannah, now. I didn't flinch. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looked at the clock on the wall and smiled. You're a minute late, Dad. Right on cue, the heavy oak front door swung open. Richard spun around, ready to yell at whoever had walked into his moment of victory, but the words died in his throat. Walking straight into the entryway was Marcus Vance, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit carrying a sleek leather briefcase, and right beside him stood a uniformed court officer holding an official stack of legal summonses. Richard's face drained of colour in an instant. The hunter had officially stepped straight into the trap. What is the meaning of this? Richard stammered, stepping back as Marcus Vance walked into the centre of the room. Marcus didn't even acknowledge Richard's outburst. He smoothly opened his briefcase, retrieved an official court order, and handed a copy directly to my father while the court officer stood guard by the door. I am serving you with a formal cease and desist, Richard, Marcus said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. As of midnight last night, Hannah turned 18, triggering the full release of the Arthur and Eleanor Morgan Irrevocable Trust. Hannah is the sole beneficiary, and I am the primary trustee. You have zero legal standing, zero authority over these properties, and zero claim to any business assets. Evelyn gasped, clutching Richard's arm. That's impossible. We brought our own legal paperwork. Your paperwork is completely worthless. Marcus replied with a cold, dismissive chuckle. And it gets worse for you. 8 months ago, Arthur realised you were attempting to manipulate his finances. He restructured the entire enterprise. He placed the main company, the primary bank accounts, and all real estate into the protected trust. Marcus stepped forward, dropping a thick financial ledger onto the table beside Richard's useless documents. However, Arthur did leave you one thing, Richard. He left you the subsidiary holding company, the exact entity you've been trying to claim as your own. What you fail to realise is that subsidiary carries over $400,000 in defaulted equipment loans and back taxes. By attempting to seize management today, you legally assumed full personal liability for those debts. Richard's mouth dropped open as he stared at the red ink on the ledger. In his reckless rush to rob his own daughter, he had walked headfirst into hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. The panic on Richard and Evelyn's faces was total. They realised in an instant that their greed hadn't bought them a luxury lifestyle, it had bought them financial ruin. Within 2 months, news reached me that Richard was forced to sell both of his sports cars and liquidate his personal savings just to keep the bank creditors from repossessing his own house. Evelyn handled the sudden loss of status, and rumour had it their marriage was falling apart under the weight of the massive debt they had brought on themselves. Meanwhile, I took my rightful seat at the head of my grandparents' company. With Marcus guiding me, we expanded the catering business into new markets, keeping my grandparents' legacy alive with honour and pride. I moved forward into my adulthood not as a victim, but as a strong, independent woman who stood her ground when it mattered most. My grandfather always taught me that short-term greed will never outmatch long-term preparation. Now I'm curious about you. What would you have done if you were in my shoes that morning? Would you have confronted him or let the lawyers handle it completely? Let me know in the comments below.